Frustrated GOP senators blow steam on Russia, stick of Trump, Vance love affair with Putin. We'll talk about this with Uriel Epstein, the Chief Executive Officer of the Renewed Democracy Initiative. Uriel, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Uriel, Senate Republicans are growing increasingly exasperated over President Trump's refusal to give them permission to move tough bipartisan sanctions legislation against Russia and countries that buy its oil. Trump pressed European allies over the weekend to levy harsher sanctions against Russia, but he has dragged his feet on the bipartisan sanctions bill, which Republican senators were hoping to get done in July. The failure to act is fueling growing disillusionment among some Senate Republicans that Trump is not serious about helping Ukraine. Are there internal discussions among Senate Republicans about alternative ways to push the sanctions through without Trump's approval and your opinion?
Yeah, so there's a conversation right now about the possibility of adding these sanctions to another must-pass bill that will be voted. I think that needs to be passed around September 30th. But the truth of the matter is that these sanctions will not be passed without approval of the Trump administration. The very fact that the article you're citing talks about Republican senators voicing concerns, these are unnamed Republican senators. So I don't doubt that they have concerns. In fact, I've spoken to a number of Republican members of Congress directly who have told me in private that they have concerns. But there's a reason they're doing it in private and they're not willing or able yet to do it in public. For better or worse, the Republican Party remains, I think, afraid of any kind of disagreement, any kind of daylight between them and the Trump administration. So as long as Donald Trump personally blocks any stronger sanctions on Russia, even though you have over 80 senators supporting this bipartisan sanctions bill, I am skeptical of the likelihood that any sanctions will pass.
Uriel, yes, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has warned that Hungary and Slovakia could face inevitable consequences if they do not stop buying Russian oil. In your opinion, what specific inevitable consequences did Senator Lindsey Graham have in mind for Hungary and Slovakia?
Very strong words. Very, very, very strong words. No, there are not going to be any consequences, I'm sad to say, for Hungary and Slovakia. Certainly not for Hungary, where Viktor Orban remains an important Trump ally. And he, in fact, hosted the Conservative Political Action Committee conference, I think, more than once in the last couple of years. He has, of course, visited. And in fact, in recent months, Donald Trump has even cited him. He cited Viktor Orban in order to oppose mail-in voting here in the US. So that's where people can vote by mail. And so he said that Viktor Orban, a very smart person in Donald Trump's words, was opposed to mail-in voting, and that is a piece of evidence against mail-in voting. And so do I think that the United States can impose any kind of real consequences on these countries? No, I'm unfortunately not optimistic. However, I will note, that Europe, the European Union, they are in a position to impose severe consequences on these countries, and it is up to them to do so. If I were the EU right now, I would immediately consider all possibilities to expel Hungary from membership in the EU so that Hungary could stop serving as, for all intents and purposes, Putin's inside man in Europe.
We'll talk about European countries a little bit later, but about that the visit of US President Donald Trump to the United Kingdom may serve as a basis for UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his senior aides to make renewed efforts to persuade the White House leader to exert more pressure on Russia in pursuit of peace in Ukraine, reported by Politico. What specific measures might Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his team urge President Trump to take regarding Russia and Ukraine? How likely is it that this visit could influence the US approach to supporting Ukraine militarily or diplomatically?
So there are, I think, two real things that they can push the United States to do. The first is sanctions, obviously, right? And again, here it's very simple. You already have a bill in the United States Congress, in the Senate, with over 80 senators in support. That type of bipartisanship is basically unheard of in America today. And yet it's happening here. And the only reason it's not being voted on, the only reason it wasn't passed in July, is because of opposition from President Donald Trump. And that is something that is very notable. And I think that's something that Keir Starmer will certainly try to push Donald Trump to do. And then the other, of course, is to give Ukraine further weapons, right? It's to give Ukraine the ability to defend itself by itself. And in order to do that, it needs the air defense, it needs artillery, it needs just a host of weaponry that the US produces more of than any other country in the world. And I think one of the key challenges that we're facing is the fact that the administration has been hesitant to significantly increase weapons production well, not just increase weapons production, although that's a separate issue, but rather to increase weapons deliveries to the Ukrainian nation, and specifically within the Pentagon, one of the key policy planners, a guy by the name of Elbridge Colby, has been instrumental in preventing further U.S. aid to Ukraine. Now, I said U.S. aid. But what we're actually talking about, and what Keir Starmer will actually be talking about when he meets with Donald Trump, is most likely not aid, but rather sales. Because right now we're not discussing the U.S. simply giving Ukraine, billions of dollars worth of weapons as it has over the course of the last 3 years. We are talking about European countries and Ukraine purchasing those weapons from the United States and simply allowing those purchases to go through in an efficient and timely manner. So that's the core discussion in place. As for how Keir Starmer might be able to persuade the American president to do that, I think probably the key tactic in his tool belt is going to be flattery. Right? I mean, look at some of the images that you just put on the screen and the video that folks can see. It is no accident that you have this incredible pomp and circumstance, because that is what resonates with President Donald Trump. And so you are going to see Keir Starmer engage in an incredible charm offensive. He won't be alone. You're going to see, I think, you just saw the king walking alongside Donald Trump, and these types of symbolic gestures are things that Trump values, I think, above and beyond almost all else.
Uriel, you said about weapons, and we know that, yes, President Donald Trump's administration has approved the first military aid packages for Ukraine under a new mechanism through which U.S. weapons are paid for by NATO members. We talk about Pearl, and how does this new mechanism differ from previous U.S. military aid programs to Ukraine, and what do you know about these?
Well, look, I mean, ultimately the inner workings of how exactly this winds its way through the Pentagon changes dramatically, almost on a monthly basis. I would say the key difference that you're going to see between now and what we had under the Biden administration is, one, obviously that you're just going to have less, right? So first and foremost, you're not going to have American aid, you're going to have American purchases. Number two, it's going to be even slower. And it's going to be sort of, I think, even less efficient in some ways than it was under Biden. And I should note that under Biden, it was also incredibly slow, incredibly inefficient. And the way that the cost of these weapons was calculated under the Biden administration was illogical, because what they did was they didn't calculate the cost of any weapon system that we provided to Ukraine. What they did is they calculated the cost of the replacement weapon system for the United States. So, for example, we would provide Ukraine with a 30-year-old M1 Abrams tank, and that the cost that we would cite to the public of providing Ukraine with that M1 Abrams tank that's 30 years old was the cost of a brand new tank that we would provide, that we would build today. What you actually got, what the American people got, was, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of how much money the U.S. was investing in Ukrainian defense. They thought, I think the most people expected that we were just giving Ukraine billions and billions and billions of dollars of these weapons, when in fact it was well under 50% of what was actually cited publicly, because probably the majority of that money was actually stayed right here in the US and was used to replenish our military stocks with brand new equipment that was produced in the last few years. And it allowed us to get rid of equipment that had essentially been lying around for over 30 years. So that's an incredibly important distinction to make. And again, this is a problem that existed from the very first day of the full-scale invasion. It existed under Biden, and it exists now under Trump. And I think that's kind of honestly probably more important than any other process change that you might see as it relates to kind of internal Pentagon approvals. Now, one other change that is worth noting is that Joe Biden, upon leaving, had finally belatedly approved the Ukrainians to launch long-range missile attacks into Russian territory. This was something that was rescinded shortly after Donald Trump's inauguration, at some point in the last few months, and in a big way upon the leadership of Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon, where essentially, rather than under Biden, the key problem being you just had this incredible bureaucracy, you had political weakness at the top, at the level of President Biden and his cabinet, and then you had bureaucratic inefficiency at the level of the Pentagon. Today, you have, I would probably say, a little bit less actually bureaucratic inefficiency, in the sense that it doesn't have to go through as many committees. There aren't as many people that touch it. It is more centralized than it was. But the problem is that you don't just have indecision at the top levels, you actually have direct opposition to this type of support at the top levels. And unfortunately, we have never had a system in the US or leadership in the US whereby you had both the political will and the bureaucratic ability to execute. Unfortunately, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, that simply has not existed in the US.
Well, returning to the topic of sanctions, Brussels plans to present a new package of sanctions against Russia on Friday, September 19th. And as noted, the goal is, on the one hand, to accelerate the pan-European rejection of Russian oil and gas. On the other hand, the European Commission wants to increase pressure on India and China, which continue to import large volumes of oil from Russia and thereby support the Russian military economy. How will Europe enforce restrictions on India and China's oil imports from Russia, given the absence of tariffs? And your thoughts?
Again, I think similarly to the way that Lindsey Graham will enforce his concerns on Hungary and Slovakia, which is to say a lot of very strong words. I do not think the EU is going to be willing to engage in a tariff or trade war with China or India. I think they may try to put in something resembling sanctions or limitations here and there. I believe that this will be very similar to Swiss cheese. I think you're going to be able to drive full trucks through the holes in a lot of these policies. And the truth is that this is actually really not where the European Union is most effective, right? I mean, the EU's ability to truly pressure India and China is going to be kind of limited. The EU's own economy right now is suffering from significant problems. France is on the verge of bankruptcy. And so they do not have a lot of economic tools at their disposal to bring pressure to bear on those countries, most importantly India and China, that are really supporting Russia's war by buying oil directly from them. Now, again, Donald Trump in his statement pointed out the Europeans' purchasing of Russian oil and gas specifically, and he's not wrong. I should say the EU, even if you exclude the quote unquote bad actors, let's say of NATO writ large, actors like Hungary and Turkey, even if you exclude them and you only point to our allies like Germany and France, and others actually on the continent, but chiefly Germany and France, you still find that they've purchased an incredible amount of Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian resources, and that's a huge problem. Right. I mean, I think that President Trump has continued to move the goalposts. It is unrealistic for Europe to achieve zero purchases of Russian energy, because unfortunately this is a consequence of decisions that have been decades in the making, and you cannot simply turn a ship of state around that quickly after having built up infrastructure over multiple decades. So Europe will not be able to achieve zero. So I think from the point of view of the American president, this is a convenient excuse, a convenient way to avoid having to put sanctions on Russia. And again, like I mentioned from the beginning, this is him changing the goalposts yet again, right? Because he keeps sort of using different reasons, different excuses for not putting pressure to bear on Putin. But the Europeans are also guilty of being docile and of not recognizing the fact that they are not preparing for a war of tomorrow. They need to be fighting the war of today. This isn't about getting ready for something that may or may not happen in 5 or 10 years. This is about making sure you do not lose the thing that's happening today. And I'm not entirely confident that Europe has fully learned that lesson. And so, although they have been limiting their purchases of Russian energy products, they have not eliminated these purchases nearly to the extent that they should. Number one. Number two, they have not unified across the continent in a way that they should in order to minimize military inefficiencies and redundancies that they could if they were to try to unite some of their efforts more, to unite some of their defense production to their purchasing and so forth. And most importantly, number three, while they have actually been giving more to Ukraine than the United States, that the numbers have actually shifted fairly significantly over the course of the last year or so. Now Europe has actually been giving much more than us, but it's still not sufficient to actually give Ukraine what it needs to end this war. So if Europe really wanted to step up, recognizing that the United States is not in the same position with the same interests that it had a year ago, then there is still much more the EU could do that would not require it to completely crater its economy, which if they decided to go, to go into a trade war with China and India, I mean, yes, that would simply, that really would have a risk of just decimating their economy. So there's a whole host of things they could do well before having to take that step.
Uriel, President Volodymyr Zelensky has reiterated that he is ready for summit or meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump and Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin anywhere except Russia, reported by Zelensky in an interview with Sky News. Quote, I'm ready to meet with President Trump and Putin, and I'm ready to meet without any kind of conditions. How realistic is it for both the US and Russia to agree to a trilateral meeting under the current geopolitical conditions, and in what situation are we?
It's shocking to me to hear you ask the question, how realistic is it for Russia and the US as in one breath, right? As though we are aligned in some way with Russia. And yet it's hard to draw any other conclusion given how frequently these goals, ostensible goals of the Trump administration have changed, right? Originally, Trump's goal was an immediate ceasefire. Ukraine supported it. Russia opposed it. Trump said, never mind, we're fine with no ceasefire. So then the new goal was, okay, meeting with Putin, no conditions, etc. They wanted to do it in Turkey a while back. Zelensky was ready to go. Putin, of course, was not. And now again, Putin's demands for the meeting was no ceasefire. We're going to do the whole thing in one fell swoop, in one go. Let's meet and have this conversation. And again, Zelensky says yes, he's ready to do it with no preconditions. That he doesn't need a ceasefire. He will meet Putin either way. And again, as expected, Putin backs off. The truth is that no meeting will happen at all until and unless Putin realizes that he cannot win this war. And so right now, why would Putin want to meet? It's illogical, right? Because he believes that he now has the, if not support, at least the acquiescence, the agreement of the U.S. To go on, that the U.S. won't get involved. And he believes that if he just keeps up the pressure and is able to wait it out for another 1 to 2 years, he will get much more than he could get today, and maybe he could even win the war altogether. That's what is going on in his head. So why would he agree to any type of meeting today where he would have to concede things that in his mind he believes he will not have to concede a year or two from now? In my view, the only way to actually get to the point of a meeting with the Russian dictator is to demonstrate incontrovertibly that Russia cannot win on the battlefield. And the way that you get to that point, and the way that Donald Trump maybe could win his Nobel Prize that he clearly so ardently desires, is for him to demonstrate his support for Ukraine and to give Ukraine the means to prove to Russia that they cannot win what they wish to win on the field of battle.
Uriel, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you for interesting conversation and supporting our country. Guys, subscribe on our YouTube channel, like this video, and see you. I need to say that Uriel Epstein, the Chief Executive Officer of the Renew Democracy Initiative, was with us today. Uriel, I wish you all the best and see you.
Thank you very much.